Hello, everyone. You are very welcome to our last session in our Research in Action seminar series at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Luciana Lolich, and I'm the Research Impact Officer at the School of Nursing and Midwifery. This series explores how research can drive real-world impact in policy and practice. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Fergus McAuliffe, Head of Research Engagement and Impact at Trinity Research. Fergus works on engaged research, knowledge mobilization, science communication, and research impact across and beyond the university. He has extensive experience in public engagement and science communication, including as a winner of Fame Lab International, a finalist for the Guardian Science Writing Prize, as a presenter on RTE's 10 Things to Know About, and a contributor to Newstalk FM Future Proof. Today's webinar is titled From Lab to Lasting Impact, Engaging Audiences with Research. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. McAuliffe. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Luciana, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And as Luciana mentioned, I'm the Head of Research Engagement and Impact in Trinity Research, and I joined Trinity about 9 months ago. So today's webinar is all about engaging audiences with research. So it's less about on the policymaking side, but it is a conduit through which one can reach policymakers. As mentioned, my experience mainly to date is on the societal impact front and on public engagement research. But really, today's webinar is about stories and the ability to tell stories about research and the ability to listen to other people's stories that might inform your research. So when we think about researchers or policymakers, patients, or members of the public, we all have one thing in common, and we're all human. And because of that, we all have a tendency to try and make sense of the world around us through narrative and through stories. So this particular webinar is going to begin with a story, but it's not one that I'm going to tell you. It is one that you're going to tell yourself. So on the next slide, you'll see a short video. It's about 90 seconds long. And it was made over 80 years ago by two psychologists, Haider and Simmel, in 1944. There's no sound in this video. There's just some shapes on a screen, and I want you to watch the video and I want you to note down what story do you see. So what was the story that you saw there? Was it two triangles and a circle, or was it more than that? So this is an excerpt from David Eagleman's book, The Brain and the Story of You, and he focuses on Haider and Simmel's study from 1944. And the key thing for me here is that when people are asked, so when they watch this film and they're asked to describe what they see, you might expect things like it's just shapes moving around on a screen, because in essence, that's all that's happening. But that's often not what viewers report. So they will describe a love story happening. They'll describe a chase. a fight, or a victory. And Hyder and Zimmel, they use this animation to help us understand that as humans, we see meaning and we see emotions and we see motivations everywhere. And ultimately, we can't help but impose stories because stories help us make sense of what's happening in the world around us. And this fascination with storytelling is something that has completely changed my career trajectory and brought me in directions that I never thought I would end up going. And it's had me working in this area for about the last 15 years. It's had me sitting across the table from those in the creative sector, from farmers, policymakers, and politicians. It's had me in the role of TV presenter, of podcast host, science writer, event producer, and evaluator. It's had me working with theatre production companies, with RTE, with News Talk, with BBC Storyworks, and film festivals. And during the last role that I had before joining Trinity, which was in the ICRAG Research Ireland Centre for Applied Geosciences, it had me down in caves, putting on choral concerts, putting pianos on beaches for the purpose of a short film that we were making. It had me working with community groups, but also meeting TDs in Leinster House. And right ever since I was a PhD student myself, I always found being really drawn towards engaging people with my research. And now in this role that I have in Trinity, I get to help others in how they do that. So, over the course of this session, I'll outline some approaches and some case studies that have worked well for me in the past, sometimes with some unexpected results. And I'll try to reflect back to you the lessons that I've learned along the way. So, when you're going anywhere, it's helpful if you have a map. And this is the map of public engagement that we use, and it shows the full spectrum of public engagement activities. Typically, it's called the public engagement onion, but when I worked in UCD, we had to call it the public engagement avocado because being in South County Dublin, we wanted to make sure that the audience understood. But if we look from the outside all the way to the inside, we see different forms of engagement. So on the outside, you see things like podcasts and festivals and stimulating public debate. But as you move from right to left, you'll see other forms of engagement that are a bit deeper. And we move into things like decision making, collaborating, and co producing spaces. Things like participatory action research, which really shapes the thinking of policymakers or forms of engagement that can be used, say, for instance, in evidence for policy synthesis. Now, this full spectrum of engagement, it's all equally valid. Towards the outside, the story is more one way, but as you move from right to left, when you get to the inside of the engagement onion, it becomes much more two-way with a very defined and sometimes a much smaller audience. But depending on what audience you want to reach and in what form, all of these can be equally effective. And this brings us to an important concept in engagement with research, and that is reach versus significance. Now, reach refers to how widespread the impacts are or how many beneficiaries there could be. Significance, on the other hand, is how important or valuable the impact is to each beneficiary. And a common illustration that we use to differentiate between these two things is that saving a single life carries immense significance and affects only one person. Whereas in contrast to that, making a small improvement to a million lives has broad reach, but the actual benefit to each individual is modest. And depending on if the story of your research is one of reach or significance, you'll ultimately need a hook to bring that research to an audience. Something that will be of relevance or a hook that that you know for sure will resonate with that audience because of how you've worked with them in the past. So some examples of hooks that we have here are things like watershed moments. So if you look back, say, even this month in Ireland, I think we had a watershed moment around the social contract and the fuel protests and the blockades. And if your research was in any way related to social change, that would be a real hook that you could use to bring an audience in. Or it could be controversial, or it could be It could be related to the current news cycle, which at the moment is being dominated by the geopolitics in the Middle East. But I firmly believe that every area of research has a hook that can be a starting point to engage audiences with research. And so for that, I'll give an example of a hook in a story that I was involved in. Now, you don't need to read everything on the slide at all. This is a paper that was written by a colleague of mine in UCD and a friend, Dr. Mark Coughlin. And the paper is essentially about using CFD modeling, which is computational fluid dynamics modeling, to help with offshore wind. The paper is mainly equations and numbers, so it's not necessarily the most accessible piece of work if you're trying to bring it out to an audience who isn't familiar with this. But when we looked inside the paper, this is one of the figures in the paper. So in the bottom left, you have the map of Ireland, and then you see the study site. So the key thing to look at is the red rectangle that's in the middle of the paper. And inside in that red rectangle, so it's a map of the seabed, and inside in that rectangle, it says SS Polwell. Now, SS Polwell, what's that? Well, the SS Polwell is a shipwreck. So it's a shipwreck dating from 1918. It was a British steamer which was sailing from Scotland to France carrying a whole load of coal. And a German U-boat, U-96, as it was passing Lambay Island, that German U-boat sent a warning shot across its bow. So the crew knew then that there was a U-boat in the vicinity and that they would have to abandon ship. So all 30 sailors managed to get off the SS Polwell in only a couple of minutes, and they managed to get onto a life vessel and make it all the way to Rockabill Lighthouse off Lambay Island. As that was happening, U-96 fired one shot at the boat, hit it right in the middle, and it sank to the bottom of the sea. Oops, sorry. Go back one there. Um, so the when it sank to the bottom of the sea, it then became a shipwreck. And the thing to realize about a shipwreck is that a shipwreck is a man-made object that is sitting on the seabed. An offshore wind turbine foundation is a man-made object that is sitting on the seabed. And you can learn a huge amount from one about the other. And in the case of this particular shipwreck, there was 80 years worth of data as to how a man-made object on the sea responds to sea currents. So we leaned exactly into that, and we did a technique called prisming. So this is where you approach a research story from as many different angles as you can. So when we were thinking about this story, because we were making a short film about it, we were like, okay, should we center the story about the researchers or should it be on the U-boat? Is there a way that we can try to tap into the story of the Lusitania, which is the most famous World War One ship sank off the coast of Ireland in that time? Is there a scene we could paint about kids on the seashore picking up bits of flotsam and looking out and wondering where has it come from? Or could we fast forward to now and take a look at the sea life that has made their home on the wreck? Could we tell the human interest story of the captains on the boats, how they had to abandon ship and end up at Rockabill Lighthouse? And how can we link all of that to the power of the sea? Because this is ultimately a story about wind power and Ireland's sustainable future and harnessing the energy of the sea. So that's exactly what we did. So we worked with BBC Storyworks to create a short film called What Do Ireland's Shipwrecks Have to Do with Renewable Energy? It's focused on the researcher. So we opened the film in Kinsale, which is where he's from, and we had him on the seashore looking out at sea, speaking about how his childhood has shaped his identity now. And then we went on to a research vessel that the Marine Institute of Ireland had lent us, and we shot sonar out of the bottom of that research vessel, and we mapped the shipwreck all live on the as part of the film. And then we use that to open a discussion about how we can study these sites of mystery and intrigue, um, these sites that are of national heritage, and how we can use that to inform, well, where are we going to actually put these offshore wind farms? And for anyone who's been following the news recently, you can see just how energy insecure Ireland is. So we were able to use this as a stepping off point to help with discussions on that. This particular short film then sat on BBC.com, which is, I think it's the most read news site in the world, or if it's not the top, if it's not the first, it's certainly in the top five. But it sat there side by side with other news content. So this particular story allowed us to have a huge amount of reach and bring this story of research happening in Ireland to a global audience. Another example of using a hook would be if I go back to Storm Éowyn. So this was an enormous storm that struck Ireland in January 2026, 2025, and it's one that we all experienced. In the aftermath of that storm, a huge amount um, of the coverage was about just how bad the storm was and the level of devastation and destruction that it caused. But also, there was a lot of talk about just, what the size of the insurance bill was and how that we as a country were going to be hit by more of these due to climate change because the storms were going to become both more frequent and more intense. Now, on the TV show that I've been presenting on for the last 12, 13 years, we were doing an episode all about storms in Ireland. Um, but we felt that if we pitched that story just in terms of the size of the insurance bill and preparedness going forward, it mightn't necessarily resonate with the viewer. So what we tried to do instead is we tried to find the human interest story in this. And what you'll see now is a short clip from the show that was broadcast last year, where I meet a farmer from County Meath who tells the story of the night that Storm Éowyn struck. Now, if you just bear with me, I just need to find the timestamp for it, which is 7:52. And forests are a vital part of our lives. They are our timber suppliers, wildlife habitats, the lungs of the planet, and a peaceful place to commune and connect with nature. But as storms become more frequent and intense, Ireland's forests are taking a battering. The impacts of Storm Éowyn on Ireland's forests were devastating. John Sherlock has been a forest owner since his father Pat passed away in 2011.
It's a family farm, so I think we've been here 6, 7, 8 generations. My father had developed Parkinson's, so he wanted something that he could be an interest in, but something that wouldn't need physical activity. The step into this was a step into the unknown for him, because he knew very, very little about forestry or anything to do with it.
So John, what are we looking at here?
So this was a plantation that we planted back in 2003. It was a Norway and Sitka spruce. It was completely wiped out in January in the Storm Éowyn. 16.5 acres flattened in one night. At the time, I was thinking, is the roof going to blow off the house? I never actually thought about what was going to happen here.
And that must have been a huge shock to you.
Oh, I couldn't believe it, because it was the one thing I never thought about. Up until now, we were thinking the risks to our forestry was insects and disease. Never thought the wind was going to be the one that'll do it.
So in that particular case, rather than taking a look at the macro level of the storm, what we focused in on was, well, how did it affect one person? And it really teed up the rest of the research that was featured in that show, because we went from that excerpt with John into meeting a researcher from Teagasc who was talking about the research that they're doing on different tree mixtures that foresters can plant and how they can manage them in different ways to make them more resilient to storms that are going forward. But that hook and that human interest story was absolutely key there. Creating an access point to research for a different audience is really central in advancing public understanding of research and societal impact. Now, my own background is not in the healthcare side of things, it's much more on the environmental side. And for the last number of years, I've worked with a variety of people from the creative sector and worked with them to explore research in ways that will reach new audiences, sometimes in quite unexpected ways, and to try and reach audiences with research that they may not necessarily be anticipating or expecting. We know that really good public engagement research, it's not a one size fits all approach. And we know this because the cognitive strategies or the personal beliefs that we all have, say for instance, in the case of climate change, well, they're all dependent on concepts like psychological difference and other societal norms that we all have. The best practice in public engagement with research understands that people's willingness to change their actions or change behavior is dependent on things like personal experiences and local risk. And the creative and cultural sectors, in particular in this country, are ideally placed to bridge the gap between what we know about research and what we feel about research, because they create spaces for dialogue, uh, for deliberation, and for allowing people to future project what difference research may make to them. An example of this from from mainstream entertainment would be the movie Don't Look Up. So this was one of the most successful pieces of communication to a mass audience to capture the climate crisis, because it took a topic that was overwhelming and depressing, one that people feel that they're essentially powerless in, and crucially, it made people laugh. So it took some of the stakes and the seriousness out of the situation, and it created the space for people to actually talk about the role of government and the role of industry in the climate crisis and the power of individual action, all the while making people to laugh. And because it was a comedy and because it was a film, it attracted many more people who were coming to be entertained rather than purely to engage with the climate crisis. So this nicely tees up an engagement project that I was involved in called We Built This City on Rock and Coal. And this is a project that I did with a group of researchers in Dublin and in Galway and an improv comedy group. And what we did was we travelled around to rural and island communities in Ireland with an improvised comedy show that the audience co-created. And our maxim was that first we wanted to make people laugh, and then we wanted to make people think. So we know that learners will absolutely thrive in an environment that acknowledges their needs, but also the experiences that they're bringing to that particular situation. And we know sometimes that say for instance, when a mistake that can occur is when you're trying to engage an audience with research, that you put the priority on sharing and imparting knowledge over building trust or tailoring your message to the audience who's actually in the room. So true and excellent inclusive science communication should center the audience as part of the experience. And that's exactly what we did in the show. So I want you to picture a scene. So you're in a community center on Achill Island, and you arrive in, and there's a series of chairs that you'll sit on, and on those chairs there's a little audience, or there's a little prompt slip for each audience member. And on the slip it says, "Tell us your biggest fear about climate change," or tell us something hopeful about the great outdoors," and you fill that in. And this is all before the show starts. Just before the show starts, a cast member comes out and collects all those prompt pieces of paper and puts them into a hat in the front and center of the stage. And then the show begins. And the improvised comedians, they come out and they pick out one of the prompt slips and they read it out. And you're hearing your prompt and your response to that prompt being read out. And immediately the improvised comedy group, they improvise a scene based on that. Now, these are not light topics that they're improvising a scene around. So these are the top 6 most common concerns that audience members had expressed when they were filling in the pieces of paper. And it was everything from their fears for their children and their children's children, the idea of that this is an inadequate societal response that we're having Are their jobs going to be affected? What are we doing to biodiversity? And just this sense of apocalypse and impending doom. So we were taking on these big worries and concerns, but we were exploring them in such a way that helped people to laugh, that took the edge out of the conversation. And then after the shows, there was really excellent conversations had whereby people were given the space and the latitude to be able to converse about the subject in a way that was less serious, as opposed to less significant, if that makes sense. Some of the evaluation that we did on this, we tried to artfully convey it here. So this is a before, during, and after, where the orange is in before, the blue words are the during, and the after is in green. And this is the evaluation that we conducted on the performers themselves, so the improvised comedy group. And you can see that before, so in orange, the height of the shadow underneath the word is directly corresponds with how frequent that word was mentioned in their responses. So you can see that before the show, they're quite unsure, or they're worried, or they're concerned. And then if we move to the green, some things have changed. It's not completely black and white, but we do see words more associated with hope. So this sense of optimism or this sense of enjoyment. And so it was really, I guess, validating for us as researchers that we could actually track the change in the improvised comedy performers over the course of that tour. You can read about this in a publication that we published just a few weeks ago in the Journal of Science Communication called Improvised Theatre for Public Engagement with the Climate Crisis in Rural Irish Communities. And you can get a sense of the project that we did there. Now, not only can theatre and performance be used to make you laugh, it can also be used to tackle really, really sensitive subjects in research. So I'll now talk through one such example that I wasn't involved with, but it is a case study that I find absolutely fascinating, and it was used as a healing intervention in the UK. So Mosaic is a support organization that works in the UK, and it's a support organization for non-abusing parents and carers of sexually abused children. Now, the problem faced by Mosaic was that the silence and the taboo around familial child sexual abuse really hinders the support that they can offer families, and it leads to delays in things like appropriate social, health, and legal interventions. So there was a researcher at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama in the University of London, and her name is Amanda Stewart Fisher, and she used this really interesting technique called verbatim theatre. What this means is that theatrical productions or plays or shows are constructed from precisely the words that are spoken by real people. And they're usually gathered in recorded interviews or diaries or official transcripts or as part of research studies. So then she created a play called From the Mouths of Mothers. And it challenged the taboos around this issue of familial and child sexual abuse. She worked with the charity to create the play to try to help to resolve the difficulty of discussing the sexual abuse of one's own children, or where the perpetrator is known to the victim and or is a family member. As part of the play, they used what's called witnessing techniques. And they used this to negotiate the relationship between taboo and ownership. Now, witnessing techniques can be extremely powerful in public engagement research, because what it does is it transforms passive spectators at a show into active witnesses, and it focuses on authentic testimony, it focuses on empathy, and crucially, it focuses on social accountability. Now, what this particular form of engagement led to was two main outcomes. The first was new understanding. So in the top left, you'll see a qualitative response from a mother whose story was depicted. So what I mean by that was her exact words were used in the show. And you can see there that she's saying that it made her look at things in a different way, whereas before she would have avoided looking at these issues, but now she had a way of addressing them. This was absolutely crucial to the success of this show, because one of the key difficulties was that a topic like this was described as lying beyond words. So what I mean by that is that people didn't have the words to describe it, and that in some cases, an easier way to deal with it was actually just to watch it being played out as part of the show. There was a clinical services manager who was evaluated as well, and that manager remarked about how the how the use of the show gave a deeper insight into how these abusers operate in our society, and that like a key consideration is that many survivors don't disclose. So that makes the need of finding a way to narrate the experience all the more acute for social workers, for caring professionals, and policymakers as well. The second key outcome was that of new training. So the show was put on in the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing in King's, and it gave the opportunity to students to actually see things in practice, but in a new way. So one of the student nurses remarked that they realized for the first time that when they were watching this show that they were struggling with competing feelings of compassion and apprehension. And it was also put on in conjunction with the Department of Social Protection in Royal Holloway. And the social workers who participated in it said that it changed their approach to dealing with child sexual abuse issues. And it turned them into having greater levels of empathy, but also made them think more about the persecutory nature in which we question or work with non-abusing parents. Um, so this was an example of how you might engage different audiences with research in quite a creative way, but one that ultimately led to an advanced therapeutic intervention. So jumping off from that, and inspired kind of by the power of writing, I want to go through two examples of case studies that I ran myself. So the first was a program that I ran in the ICRAG Research Centre when I was the Public Engagement and Communications Manager there. And that was a program called Writing the Earth that I ran in conjunction with the Irish Writers Centre, which is based on Parnell Street. Now, why we ran this program is we had this rationale around that it'll be the writers of today who imagine the ideas who will make the planet sustainable and viable for the children of tomorrow. And you can see this that is played out in some of the works of popular fiction that have mass appeal. Books like The Overstory by Richard Powers or The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And they really reach new audiences, but in really creative ways on the ecological crisis. And they also lean into this sense of activism. Now, how I ran the program was that you had a number of scientists from my research centre were paired with writers that the Irish Writers Centre had found. So essentially, it was either a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 pairing. Um, the the writers were able to write about any aspect of the climate crisis or natural resources that they would like in any form. And the purpose of the researcher was there to guide some of their initial thinking and to ground them maybe in reality at the start. But after that, the writers could go in any directions that they wanted. Envisioned initially as like like a series of 5 workshops over about 5 months. Um, but it moved in a direction that wasn't part of the original plan. So in any of these national research centres that were funded by Science Foundation Ireland back in the day, they're all constructed in the same way. So we receive money from Science Foundation Ireland, we receive money from the EU, and we also receive money from industry. And all the research centres are constructed in the same way. But working with the writers, I think there was I don't I don't think they necessarily anticipated that by working with the research centre, they could be indirectly working with industry. But I think it was perhaps eye-opening for them that they got a sense of that, like actually quite a lot of research in Ireland is conducted in conjunction with industry because that is how the funding system works here. So part of the work that the ICRAC Research Centre did was on the natural resources that are needed to power the green transition. So what I mean by that are things like the metals that go into the batteries that go into electric vehicles, or that go into the turbines that go into, or that go into the into the parts that are used in offshore wind turbines. And some of those materials are sourced from outside of Europe in much poorer countries where the workers' rights, the environmental controls are much less controlled than they would be in Europe. And the writers wanted to tackle that issue. So they wanted to know exactly what was happening in the ground in those countries, and they also wanted to hear from, say, other voices in Ireland, who might be campaign groups that were, say, like anti-mining. And we said, absolutely, we are a university, and we will never stand in the way of you gaining more knowledge from as diverse a set of opinions as you can. So we facilitated a workshop between the writers and an anti-mining campaign group that explored the thorniness of some of those issues, and that then became reflected in some of the outputs that came at the end of the program. So we had 6 new pieces of writing emerge, including 2 new plays, one of which is depicted here, and this was a play called Toxic Relationships. And what you can see on screen here is Mother Earth on the left and the moon on the right. And for the entire duration of that show, the moon moved slowly in a circle around Mother Earth, and they were joined on stage by a series of characters that depicted things like big oil, like industry, consumerism, youth, poverty, and justice. And it was a dark comedy that explored the tension between each of those different actors. Ultimately, and through and through quite a number of jokes along the way, reaching a resolution that they all had to give a little and they all had to work together. We also evaluated this, and this is a very busy slide, but if you can focus on the 2 green boxes, you can see when we go from pre to post in terms of the geoscientists, you can see a shift in how interested they become about engaging or using creative approaches to communicating their work. And if you look at the 2nd green box, you also see a shift in that they become more confident in understanding what creative writing is. If you look at the writers, so here focusing on the blue boxes, you can see a shift from pre to post around their sense of understanding about where to go to find earth science related information, but also a shift in their confidence about their understanding of the current natural resource challenges that are facing the planet. So in terms of the pre for post, we see a shift in both audience and researcher. And I also just want to give a sense of like running this particular project. It was more challenging than I envisaged, but in terms of the strength of the final pieces that came out of it, I think they were much stronger because of that. So if you'll indulge me, I'll read a short paragraph excerpt from After Elodie by the writer D. Roycroft. And this is a piece about artisanal mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and how the objects that we use every day are so far removed from the people at the coalface. And Dee's work was inspired by the work of a PhD student in Icrag at the time, who was working on cobalt. Did Elodie's mother mine, you wonder? Will her son? Does the cobalt settle in their lungs? Tiny silver poisoned eggs lining the intricate branches of bronchioles. Does it grow into their bones and infiltrate their hearts? Does Elodie have a rag to mask her mouth as she works, made from some scrap of discarded material someone carefully shaped for her, holding her in their thoughts as they did so? You hope for this, the human connection between worker and object. And to me, this showed that running a program like this can take you on an unexpected journey, and that the more you co-create with audiences, the more open you must be to answering uncomfortable questions and ceding some control and being open to the work going in a new direction. And the last example I'll give, because I know time is against us today. So this is an example of creative exploration with research that's actually quite heavily influenced by Trinity, because I worked with Professor Lawrence Gill, who is in the School of Engineering, um, and it was a project called Inception Horizon that we ran with a composer and a conductor called Nora Constance Walsh. Now, this project was all about engaging people with Professor Gill's research on groundwater. Now, groundwater it's all the water under the ground, is what it is, but it's out of sight. So you can't see it. It's the water that when you live in the countryside and you turn on the tap, and it's say like it's a house in a rural part, that all of the water coming out of the tap is groundwater, but that's basically the only time you ever see it because it's all under the ground. And what means then is that there's a complete absence of visual cues, and people find it really hard to imagine it, because they can't see it. So our aim was to bridge that gap and to co-create an immersive musical interpretation of the movement of water through subterranean karsts. Karsts being all of the rock formations in the Burren in the west of Ireland, which was actually Professor Gill's study sites. And what we did is we ran a 3-year long program where we worked with a community choir called the Mellotonics, and also worked with the Slovenian Karst Research Institute. And we put on 2 concerts, one in the museum building in Dublin and one actually in a cave in Slovenia. We also turned this into a short documentary that we entered into an Australian film festival. And what we did was we created a new piece of music that actually reflected Lawrence's research, but in a way that people could feel it and they could hear it. So we brought members of the choir actually down into a cave in the Burren to experience what the underground is like, to hear how groundwater moves, or to hear the sounds that groundwater makes as it moves through caves, how it takes little chunks out of the rock, how it shapes them into little scallops over time. And when you're doing research in the area, you know that there's actually a whole underworld of activity happening under your feet with caves. They're slowly being formed. There's corrosion constantly occurring. And this was reflected in the lyrics of the piece, where the choir sang about all of the turbulence of the reactions, how they're aggressive to calcite, and just how deep it occurred. And even the musicality of the piece changed over the course of the song, because it starts off at the surface in a very high pitch, and then as the water starts to go down underground and starts to move through the deep and dark cave systems, all of the bass singers in the choir take over. And it's a really evocative piece, and we wanted people to be able to experience this research that we're doing without ever actually having to enter a cave to do so. On the evaluation, we found that and this is the evaluation that was done on the choir members themselves. We found that it enhanced their understanding of karst. It also enhanced their understanding and their confidence in earth science issues. And on some of the qualitative side, you can see some of the emphasis I put there about them partaking in this particular public engagement project really helped them to pay a lot more attention to the natural world around them, but also made them much more aware of what's being done to utilize and protect the natural resources that we have. Now, probably the most important, or the most rewarding thing for me to come out of this project was that it reached new audiences with new forms of research engagement. So the choir members weren't taking part in the project they were because they were already bought into the concept of groundwater. They were taking part in it because they just wanted to sing. The people who came to the concerts in the museum building and in Slovenia weren't there for the science. They came to listen. And then when the choir went on to be commissioned for other pieces of music inspired by other areas of research, they did so because they enjoyed it, not because they knew that the most important research policymaker in the country, the Minister for Further and Higher Education, was going to come and listen to them perform under a giant moon in Merrion Square last November. So there are many different ways to reach audiences, and you never know who might be at a creative performance, what power that might person have, or what power that person might have, and how it might slightly shape their thinking about how they engage with research. So I would encourage people at today's webinar to think outside the box in how you engage audiences with your research. Because just like our caves, our creative culture here runs really deep. So how do you engage people with research that they can't see? And how do you bring them along? Well, you find the Mellotonics community choir, you find their interests, and you weave your science through song. To the west of Ireland we went, where it rains, yet where does it all go? Because the Burren has no rivers, and we research what's down there, where the dark waters flow. An inception horizon is the break in the rock that lets water in. And when acid meets calcite, it dissolves. You get caves, and they're long and they're thin. Wearing hard hats and torches, we descended beneath the low-lying limestone plains, following the cave's story, its sinuous, scalloped insides branching along tortuous karst veins. Learning through touch, through sound, the choir traced the shape of water to a distant spring, and over campfires and guitars that night a nascent score was composed. Time to sing. Songs move and stories stir, and a feeling is almost never conquered with a fact. So how then, for research, do you get people to act? Will you go to where they are, their lungs, their vocal cords, a singing face, mixing altos, tenors and sopranos, and caves reverberating with the sound of bass? Art can give us a unique perspective on the world and reminds us that it's a living thing. This is just one line, but it's the important one because a change was being made, and those are the choir's words, not mine. So choose narrative, choose art, communicate your research with a crescendo, choose plotline and arc, pitch and timbre, and build up to the denouement. This is science storytelling through song to give you something to surmise on. So research in action attendees, here's a closing clip from Inception Horizon. So that's it from me. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. McAuliffe, for a fantastic, engaging, and very moving presentation. I thought that what you were saying about storytelling it's fascinating, and it really is what many times differentiates us from animals are in the world is our ability to tell stories, to come together, even with that video you were showing of the triangle and the circle. I immediately had a story around who was the bad guy, who was the good, who you had to help, who you empathize with. So I thought that that's very, very interesting to apply to research. So I'm going to give some time for people to type questions on the chat. We have a few more minutes. So maybe just to kick that off, I'm going to ask you a question. So from what you were saying in your presentation, you have worked across academia, media, and research institutes. And how have these different contexts shaped your approach to research engagement?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Like I think when you do work in the media, you realize how time constrained you are, and you realize, especially when it's television, like how important visuals are, and that the visuals can completely make or break the success or not of telling a research story. Whereas when you do, say, when you do a research engagement activity, say with a community, and it's over time, that can be a much slower process, but ultimately quite like much more rich. So what I mean by that is when you enter into a process of like true co-creation with a community, you don't necessarily know where you're going to end up. Whereas in the media, you know that ultimately you need to produce a piece that is 4 minutes and 30 seconds long. Or in the case of radio, you know that you're only going to have, there's only time because of broadcast limitations, there's time for two questions at 60 seconds of a response each, and you must get to the point immediately. And you basically have your talking points worked out in advance. So, like those two sort of opposite sides of the same coin really have helped me to empathize with people who are either coming from the community sector, who need maybe that bit more time or need things done in a certain way, all the way to media where you have to engage with them on their own rules because of time constraints.
Very good. So in a way, what you were saying there about on television, maybe you have that reach and you have more
Mhm.
control, but then when you work in co-creating, you have that significant aspect because you go to the individual that they're telling something that is significant to them.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so just one more question then from myself. What are some of the key challenges you think in ensuring that engaged research leads to sustained impact, maybe rather than a once-off outreach activity?
Yeah. So, like as we move towards doing more engaged research, and certainly we can see some of the main funders in this space um, changing the direction of research so that it becomes more like that. I think having an openness there to doing things in partnership. So, like often, and I know this myself, as having been a researcher, you like to be in control and you like to know, okay, well, this is the 4 year plan or this is the 2 year plan. Whereas when you actually do true engaged research and you have societal impact champions that are embedded within the research or the end users or the beneficiaries, um, what they're interested in may not necessarily be exactly what your research question is. But if you're trying to do engaged research that is ultimately there to benefit those audiences and those end users, you must take those considerations and those lived experiences into account because it will ultimately end up with better research having occurred and research that can actually lead to a better impact from those audiences. So there is a mindset shift that we must have, whereby we are doing research with society as opposed to for or on. But that does mean ceding a little bit of control and embracing that as well.
Thank you. So we have a lot of comments saying that was a wonderful presentation and thank you. And then we have a question from Deidre saying, when and how did you get into social engagement?
Yeah, so that happened when I was doing my PhD. I realized maybe about halfway through that, listen, I prefer kind of talking about research and writing about research and presenting and running events and stuff as opposed to say the doing of the research itself. Um, just whatever way my brain worked at the time. So I ended up entering, those like 3 minute thesis conference and things like that. I ended up entering those competitions and really putting a lot of effort into the scripting of my talk and into the practice of it. And those competitions went really well. And from those, like other doors opened. So there was one particular competition that I did that was recorded, and a TV production company saw a recording of my talk, and then they asked me to take part in their TV show, and that's how the whole thing started. But for me, the key, like all of the researching and the writing and the practice that I did as a PhD student for those competitions served me incredibly well when I then had to do it in front of camera because I had to remember, scripts that were 2 or 3 minutes long. I had to have them all, especially when you're doing it in front of camera and it's not live. You need to know, um, like if you make any deviation, you have to cut and start again. So all that practice that I had for the competitions served me really well when it came to doing all the media stuff. So that's how I started, and those opportunities still exist here in Ireland. If anyone would like to know more of any of that, feel free to reach out to me afterwards.
Thank you. And this has to be the last question because we're running out of time. So a question from Owen. How would you take a research topic that only affects a smaller number of people, for example, a rare disease research, and make it accessible and interesting for a wider audience?
Yeah, excellent question. Thanks, Owen. Um, so to me, it would be telling a story that that would resonate with the wider audience. So like obviously in the case of rare diseases, there is a limited number of people that are particularly affected by that. Um, but those people do, they are members of our community, and we see them at sporting events or concerts or whatever it may be. And so the chances are that most people will know someone or 2 degrees of separation away from someone with a rare disease. And if you can tell a story that showcases what it's like to live with that disease, or showcases maybe some of the hidden challenges of that disease, that can be a great way of bringing an audience with you. Like and if you can do justice to the lived experience of a person who has a rare disease like that, that can be a compelling storyline for others to watch and for others to listen to.
Thank you. Maybe we can squeeze one more question.
Yeah.
Should you think about research engagement as part of your research funding and set aside money towards that from the beginning? That's a question from Patricia.
So do you think of research engagement as a part of your research funding? Yeah, so that's actually kind of happening anyway, Patricia. So we see in particular in some of the big like Research Ireland centres, traditionally they would have had, say, a separate ring fence pot of money for what was described as EPE, or education public engagement. As those research centres are evolving, we're now seeing much more that those type of traditional engagement activities now actually occur in the research program. So they're built into the research projects from conception, as opposed to being adjacent to or attending to the research. So as we go forth in this space, I think we will start to see a much stronger shift to this idea of engaged research with society, as opposed to public engagement for society.
Okay, thank you. Do you think we can have one more? Is the last question, so I'm going to try to squeeze this one. Any thoughts on how to support that culture shift to embracing co-creation and supporting researchers to think about and leave their comfort zone and traditional research? From Norrin.
Well,
1 minute.
so we in Trinity are actually starting a community of practice in engagement. Our first meeting is on the 11th of May in the business school. It's open to anyone who would like to be able to do more research in this area. And we'll also be talking about a Research Ireland funding opportunity to support your work in this. Alongside that, we are also having I guess we're doing an internal reflective piece about how we can best support researchers within Trinity who are trying to make a difference on policy. So we're looking to create a knowledge brokerage structure whereby we can help researchers make those connections with policymakers to ultimately lead to greater real world impact. So there'll be more on that coming up in the next few months. And if anyone would like to know any more about that, do reach out to me directly.
Okay, thank you so much. We have to leave it there. Thank you, Dr. McAuliffe, for sharing your experiences today and a very good presentation. Thank you for Jenny and Elizabeth for the technical support. And thanks to all of you for joining this final, but certainly not least session of our Research in Action series. And we hope to leave you with fresh insights and inspiration for engaging research with communities, policy, and practice. Thanks very much. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone.